And the point I want to make is, as a Christian, to grow in God, to not be deceived, we must understand the agape love of God as God means it to be understood, even though that word itself, agape love, is nothing but a natural word. In other words, Luke 6:32, sinners have this kind of love to sinners. So there's a natural understanding of the word because God has to use the language you understand to speak to you. But what should be inside those words is the power of God, of how God means them. Because when God speaks about how he loves the world, to him, he sent a son, and that love made you a son. I mean, what a miracle. You went from death to life. You became adopted. You went from someone on the outside of God to a new creature on the inside of God. That was from the love of God. But yet, here we see Luke 6:32, where the sinners have this love for each other. That's because it only appears that way because he has to use natural words in the language that you grew up with. But the power inside that words must come from the mind of Christ and not just knowledge. Because if you're trapped in this natural soul knowledge that cannot understand or receive from God because it's still from the first man Adam, then you're going to say, okay, well now I'm no longer really confident that God loves me because you just told me Luke 6:32 that sinners have this same love. Well, that's true in the natural. None of this works. It's all flat, two-dimensional. There's no depth to it. There's no life to it. A good example I like to give about the difference between knowledge in a natural soul versus how God uses these words in power. I call them new heaven words. They come from another planet. They're not from this earth, and they're filled with life and power. And a good way I use to explain this is, picture the TV screen that you're watching me on, or the video screen, right? It's just this square, flat object. So picture that like 2 dimensions, right? Where you can go this way or you can go this way. That's the only 2 dimensions that a flat screen can go into. In other words, there's no depth. So, and for the sake of this teaching, just picture going this way and this way, a left and a right. And for example, when it comes to knowledge in the natural soul, we can legalize grace or we can greasify grace. That's all we can understand it. Why? Because we're stuck in like this flat 2-dimensional world that doesn't understand the real life of God. So now picture the life of God as a 3-dimensional object. Another good example is, so picture a flat TV screen, right? There's no depth to it. It has no capacity to understand depth. It's locked in the 2 dimensions. So now imagine yourself, because you live in 3-dimensional world. So picture a round basketball. Now take this basketball and pass it through your 2-dimensional screen. And you can look this up online. You can find all this online to get a better understanding. But I know I can explain it to you real simple. So what would taking a real 3-dimensional basketball and passing it through a 2-dimensional screen, what would that look like to the people who are stuck in 2-dimensional land, stuck with knowledge? They can either legalize grace, or for the sake of this teaching, they'll legalize the basketball, or they'll greasify the basketball. In other words, what will a 3-dimensional basketball look like to them as it passes through their 2-dimensional land? Well, the first thing that's going to happen is a tiny dot will appear as the first parts of the round basketball touch their 2-dimensional world, their 2-dimensional TV screen. Just a small dot will appear. But then as the basketball keeps passing through, that dot will get into a bigger and bigger circle until you get to the halfway point of the basketball. And then as the latter half of the basketball passes through two-dimensional screen, that circle gets smaller and smaller and smaller until it gets back to a dot again and then disappears. So then if you ask everybody who lives in this two-dimensional knowledge world, you say, well, explain to me what a basketball is. I mean, every hand would go up. And they would say, oh, I know. I'd say, okay, well, Johnny, tell me what you think a basketball is. A basketball is a little dot that goes into a big circle, and then the circle gets smaller again and back to a dot, and then it disappears. That's going to be his understanding of a basketball. Now, you and I who live in three-dimensional world, we know that's not what a basketball is. A basketball is this three-dimensional object. See, but in two-dimensional land, they cannot understand it or receive it. Well, that's the same way with the love of God. The love of God is three-dimensional life. You became a new person. But yet, in our natural soul, still from Adam, can't receive from God, can't understand these things from God. It thinks it can, but it can't. So when we, instead of basketball, call it the grace of God, the grace that brings this new life, when it transformed you because you believed the simple gospel. In other words, when you accepted Christ, you actually became a three-dimensional world to understand the three-dimensional basketball. So you did get born again. It was a complete miracle. But now that you are that, you're still inside a two-dimensional, you still have a two-dimensional natural soul, so to speak. So now when you tend to look at what happened to you, your natural soul starts computing and reasoning, but all it can do is greasify that grace or legalize that grace. It cannot understand what happened to you, and it cannot go any further, again, because you're locked inside this natural soul. So there must be a way where, and that's the beauty of praying in tongues, is God found a way to bypass your natural soul, speak right to your spirit, and then when your spirit's built up enough, strong enough, it then can pull down the understanding of the natural soul and then be edified and go further into God.